"Please do it quickly," said the maid. The king took off his cloak and everything changed that night. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. Eleanor Walsh woke to the sound of boots striking stone. At first she thought she was still dreaming, still caught in the restless half-sleep that came after evenings of long work and too little rest. But then the knock came. Sharp, decisive, unmistakably official. The door shuddered against the force of it. She sat up at once. The candle on the small table beside her had long gone cold. Darkness pressed close around her, the kind found only in the servant corridors of Windsor Palace, where windows were narrow and nights lasted longer. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, breathed once, then opened the door. A palace guard stood in the dim corridor, armored and stern even at this hour. His presence alone jolted her more awake than any bell could have. Guards did not come for maids unless something was terribly wrong. He spoke quietly. "Eleanor Walsh, the king has summoned you." Her breath caught. Summoned. At this hour. She felt her pulse leap. Her first thought was that someone had accused her of negligence. Her second was worse, that someone important had taken ill and they needed hands to help. But the guard's tone offered no hint, only urgency. She stammered, "Now, in the middle of the night? Immediately?" She nodded, though fear pooled cold in her chest. She had only been at Windsor for a year, hardly long enough to understand the deeper rhythms of palace life, but long enough to know that midnight summons rarely ended kindly. She followed the guard through the narrow servant passageways, her heart beating harder with every turn. Shadows stretched along the stone floor, and every step echoed too loudly. It felt as though they were traveling into the very center of the night itself. Eleanor cleared her throat. "Is His Majesty unwell?" The guard didn't answer. He simply quickened his pace. She swallowed her questions after that. When palace guards chose silence, it was best not to insist. Still, unease tightened her stomach. She reviewed her duties from the day. Had she polished silver incorrectly? Spilled something without noticing? Misaddressed a lady-in-waiting? But no error she could imagine warranted a royal summons. The corridors grew broader, the walls smoother, the candles brighter. They were approaching the king's private quarters. Her steps slowed. She suddenly felt very small, as though each stride carried her beyond the world she was meant to inhabit. Eleanor had seen the king only from a distance during ceremonies, always surrounded by noblemen, ministers, and the Queen's household. She had never exchanged a word with him. When they reached the final corridor, the guard halted. At the far end stood a tall set of doors flanked by 2 sentries. A thin slice of warm light shone beneath the heavy wood. The guard leaned close to her, and for the first time she heard uncertainty in his voice. "Announce yourself. Speak clearly." Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled. She took a breath to steady herself, but her fear broke free before she could stop it. She whispered, not to him, but to herself, desperate to have it over with. "Please, do it quickly." The guard gave her a strange look, but he did not ask what she meant. Instead, he turned, rapped once on the door, and announced her presence. "Your Majesty, Eleanor Walsh has arrived." Silence stretched for a long, breathless moment. Then a calm voice answered from within. "Send her in." The guard stepped aside. Eleanor forced her feet to move. Inside, the king's chamber was lit by candles that flickered against the tall walls and cast warm shadows across the floor. It was not lavish the way she had imagined. There were carpets and carved furniture, yes, but not the overwhelming splendor of the grand halls. It felt more lived in, more human. She barely had time to take in these impressions before her attention fell on the man standing near the hearth. King Edward IV was removing his heavy cloak, shaking off drops of night mist. His movements were slow, weary. When he turned, Eleanor realized she had rarely seen a face so striking up close, not because of its handsomeness, though there was that, but because of its quiet exhaustion. The weight of the crown lay upon his shoulders more visibly than any jeweled ornament. His gaze rested on her, curious, thoughtful, and far gentler than she expected from a king. "Eleanor Walsh," he said, as though testing how her name sounded in his voice. She lowered into a deep curtsy. "Your Majesty, you may rise." She did, but her knees wobbled slightly. He watched her for a moment. "You seem frightened. Did the guard alarm you?" No, Your Majesty. I only wish to understand why I was called. He nodded, as though that answer pleased him. You were chosen because you are new enough to the palace to be unentangled in its politics, yet respected enough to perform delicate work. He gestured toward a table near the window, scattered with documents. I have had a long night of meetings, and more await me at dawn. I require assistance to prepare. Eleanor blinked. That was all? A task? A practical request? I feared I had done something wrong, she admitted softly. The king's expression softened further. No, quite the opposite. You were recommended as someone discreet and diligent. I need that tonight. He motioned to his cloak, now spread across a chair. Would you mind helping with these? I have little strength left for details. Her relief was so great she nearly sagged. She stepped forward, hands steadying. Of course, Your Majesty. She lifted the cloak, surprised at how heavy it was, chilled from the mist. She folded it carefully, setting it aside. The king watched her work, not intruding, simply studying her as though she were a puzzle he wished to understand. You have been at Windsor for a year? He asked. Yes, Your Majesty. Where were you before that? In Sussex. My father is a steward on a small estate. She hesitated, unsure how much a king cared for the past of a maid. I came here to earn my own living. His smile was faint, but real. Independence is admirable. She felt warmth creep into her cheeks at the unexpected praise. She turned to the table, gathering robes and straightening the papers he indicated. The tasks were simple enough, yet she felt strangely aware of every movement, every breath, every inch of distance between them. The chamber seemed to thrum quietly around them. As she adjusted the fastenings on one of his garments, her fingers brushed his hand. She drew back at once. Forgive me, Your Majesty. There is nothing to forgive. His voice was soft, but steady. It unsettled her more than any rebuke could have. He stepped closer, not enough to break propriety, but enough that she felt the warmth of his presence. Tell me, Eleanor, do you know why I asked for someone untouched by court whispers? She shook her head. Because most people here speak to me with motives, not honesty. I wanted someone whose eyes did not hold calculation. His gaze remained on her, studying her face. You look as though you speak plainly. She did not know how to respond. She smoothed the folds of his robe to avoid staring at him too directly. I only speak what I know to be true. Then you are rare in this palace, he murmured. Her heart thudded uncomfortably. Before she could think what to say next, a sharp knock split the quiet. Your Majesty, a voice called from behind the door, urgent and hushed. The Queen seeks you at once. Eleanor froze. The king's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the door, then back at her. His expression shifted, calm, guarded, unreadable. He stepped toward her, lowering his voice. Eleanor Walsh, he said quietly. Do you know why I called for you tonight? Eleanor's breath caught at the question. She stood very still, the king's gaze fixed steadily on her, as though waiting for something she did not yet understand. The world outside the chamber door seemed to fade. The urgent knock, the messenger's voice, even the Queen's demand, dissolved into a muted hum. She finally managed to whisper. No, Your Majesty, I do not. He studied her a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped back, straightening the sleeves of his robe with a measured calm. We will speak of it soon, he said quietly. But not now. The knock sounded again, sharper this time. Your Majesty, the voice repeated. Her Majesty insists. King Edward exhaled once, a sound that carried both weariness and restraint. He gestured to Eleanor with a slight movement of his hand. Remain where you are. He crossed the room, opened the door only a fraction, and spoke in a low tone meant for the messenger alone. Eleanor could hear only fragments. Tell the Queen. Morning. I have been working since... The messenger interrupted. She says it cannot wait. The king's tone shifted into something colder. It will wait. There was a tense pause, then the quiet retreat of footsteps. When the hall fell silent again, he closed the door and turned back to Eleanor. She lowered her head. I should go, Your Majesty. He shook his head. Not yet. She hesitated, unsure whether it was truly an order or a wish. He seemed to sense her uncertainty, for he continued, his voice softer than before. Do not fear the Queen's interruptions. She sends for me often on matters of little consequence. He gestured toward the table again. Finish the fastenings, and speak freely with me. You look as though words are trapped in your throat." Her hands trembled as she reached for the last of his garments. "I only fear that my presence will cause trouble." He watched her with a thoughtful expression. "If anyone here were to cause trouble, it would not be you." She lifted her gaze. There was something in his face, an exhaustion deeper than lack of sleep, a loneliness that seemed to hollow his shoulders. She had seen noblemen in the halls, seen them laugh loudly, argue heatedly, whisper behind doors. But she had never seen a king look quite so human. She cleared her throat. "If you wish for assistance in the morning as well, I can return." "Do you offer because you wish to help?" he asked quietly, "or because you fear the consequences if you refuse?" The question startled her. She froze with her hands on a folded garment. I do not refuse work, Your Majesty. That is not what I asked." Her cheeks warmed and she looked down. "I offer because you look in need of help, that is all." For a moment silence draped the room. Then he nodded slightly. "Honesty again. You do not disappoint." She felt flustered, unsure whether to bow, respond, or continue her task. To distract herself, she moved quickly, arranging his documents into neat stacks. The king stepped beside her, scanning one of the pages covered in hurried ink. "These ministers have no sense of time," he muttered. "They demand answers at hours when even the palace cats are asleep." Eleanor blinked, surprised by the dryness in his tone. She dared a small smile. "Then perhaps, Your Majesty, tomorrow will seem kinder if tonight ends more quickly." He looked down at her with a faint spark of amusement. "Is that your polite way of telling me to sleep?" She shook her head. "Only that your burdens might feel lighter with rest." He studied her again, not critically but intently, as though trying to understand her from the inside out. She tried to focus on her work, but her heart beat loudly at the unexpected attention. "Tell me something," he said suddenly. "Do you trust easily?" She paused. "No, Your Majesty." "Why not?" Her hands stilled on the edge of the table. "Because trust can be taken advantage of, especially here." He nodded slowly. "And yet you speak to me without calculation." "I speak because you have asked me to." "Not everyone honors a king's request so simply," he said. "Some twist their words into traps." She lowered her gaze. "I have no traps, Your Majesty." "No," he said quietly. "I believe you do not." She finished folding the final garment and stepped back, unsure whether she was expected to stay or dismissed. The king walked toward the hearth, staring at the low flames. The fire cast a warm glow across his face, highlighting the shadows beneath his eyes. "Do you know," he said softly, "how many people in this palace speak to me as though they love the crown more than the man who wears it?" Eleanor hesitated. "It must be difficult, Your Majesty." "It is isolating," he replied, "though I doubt I should confess that to anyone, least of all to a young maid." She took a step closer before thinking. "Then why confess it to me?" He turned his head, meeting her eyes. "Because you look at me without fear or ambition. It has been a long time since anyone did." She felt her breath tremble. "I fear many things, Your Majesty, but not you." His gaze deepened at that. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she stepped back quickly, remembering herself. "I should not have spoken so boldly." "You spoke truth," he said. "Truth is never a fault." But she feared boldness might be. She could already imagine the whispers that might rise if anyone discovered she had spent the night assisting the king. Even without impropriety, her presence alone could be twisted into scandal. She swallowed. "Your Majesty, shall I continue in the morning? Or should I not return unless summoned?" He seemed to consider that for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Return. I trust you." The words felt heavier than any robe she had lifted that night. She bowed slightly, though her voice wavered. "Very well, Your Majesty." Just as she stepped away from the table, the door opened abruptly. She gasped, turning sharply. But it was only a guard from the outer hall, bowing quickly before speaking. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty. The Queen insists upon a reply." His eyes flicked to Eleanor, and she felt heat surge to her face. The guard's gaze lingered long enough to sting with judgment. The king dismissed the guard with a curt gesture. After the door closed, he looked at Eleanor, and something like regret flickered through his expression. "So you will face whispers for this," he said quietly, "even if nothing improper has happened." She nodded once, her throat tight. "I know, Your Majesty, and you fear that." "Yes." He stepped closer. not touching her, not reaching for her, only closing the distance enough that his voice lowered. "If any accusation reaches you, you will tell me. Do you understand?" "I do. And you will not face them alone," her breath unsteadied. "Your Majesty, I am only a maid." "And I," he said gently, "am still a man who values decency when he sees it." She lowered her gaze again. "I thank you for your kindness." He looked as though he meant to say more, but footsteps approached from the corridor again. A murmur of voices trailed behind them. He stiffened. "You should go now." She bowed quickly. "Good night, Your Majesty." She moved toward the door, hoping to slip out quietly, but the moment she stepped into the corridor, several ladies-in-waiting turned their heads sharply. They had been walking together toward the Queen's wing, but at the sight of her emerging from the King's chamber, they stopped. Their measured stares caught her like hooks. One whispered to another, far too loudly for politeness. "Well, that explains why the Queen was so restless this evening." Another added, "A maid summoned at this hour, he must be slipping in his judgment." Eleanor felt a sharp sting in her chest. She kept walking, head down, but their voices followed. "I always wondered how long it would take for some servant girl to try her luck. She walks as though she's done nothing. Look at her." Her cheeks burned, but she stayed silent. Words would only worsen matters. She walked faster, heart pounding against her ribs. But the last voice she heard, cold, cutting, struck deeper than the others. "So, the King has found himself a new distraction, has he?" Eleanor did not allow herself to look back. She kept her steps small and controlled, the way servants were trained to move, though her insides shook with every whisper. The corridor seemed longer than usual, as though the palace itself had stretched to trap her in the murmurs she was desperate to escape. When she finally reached the servants' stairwell, she stole one quick, shaking breath before descending. The stairs were narrow and cold, but she welcomed the dimness. It shielded her from eyes that judged without hearing a single truth. She clutched the railing as she descended, her heart still echoing with the cruel remark from the Queen's attendants. Distraction. The word felt sour and shameful, as though they had already reduced her to something she was not. When she reached the lower corridor, another maid named Sarah stepped out from a small side room holding linens. Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of Eleanor's pale face. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor shook her head. "Nothing. Only a long task." Sarah frowned. "A task that brings you from the King's chamber?" Eleanor stiffened. "Say nothing, Sarah. Please." Sarah's face softened. She lowered her voice. "I won't. But be careful. The Queen's women saw you. It was all over their faces." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "I did nothing wrong." "I believe you," Sarah whispered, "but belief in this palace doesn't matter. It is the whispers that decide everything." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Sarah touched her arm gently before moving on. The simple kindness steadied her, but only a little. Eleanor finished her duties clumsily that night, her mind replaying every look, every hushed voice. She barely slept. When dawn finally came, she felt as though she had been awake for days. By midday, the rumors had grown legs. In the laundry room, 2 footmen leaned against the wall, speaking in low voices. Eleanor passed by them, head down, hoping to be invisible. "It was her," one said, nodding toward her. "I saw her leaving his chamber with my own eyes." "You saw her in the corridor," the other corrected. "Not the chamber." "Same thing, isn't it?" Eleanor gripped her basket tighter. It wasn't the same thing at all, but truth rarely mattered once gossip took root. She hurried past them, pretending not to hear, but the whispers traveled with her. By afternoon, even the older maids, women who had served for decades, watched her with a mixture of pity and wariness. Eleanor wanted to hide, but her duties forced her through hallways, past doorways, under the scrutiny of eyes she could not avoid. When she reached the smaller passage near the silver stores, she finally found a moment of quiet. She set down her basket and pressed a hand over her eyes. It felt foolish to cry over rumors, but the sting of humiliation cut deeply, not because she had been caught, but because she had done nothing to deserve it. A soft sound startled her. She turned sharply. One of the Queen's attendants stood at the end of the corridor, a pale, narrow-faced woman with a sharp chin and an expression trained to reveal nothing. Her presence alone was enough to make Eleanor straighten. "Miss Walsh," the attendant said, her tone smooth as polished glass. A moment, if you please. Eleanor dipped a small curtsy. Yes, ma'am. The woman stepped closer, her shoes making quiet taps on the stone floor. The Queen is aware of your unusual movements last night. Eleanor felt her pulse race. I was summoned for work, ma'am. Nothing improper occurred. The woman's smile was thin. Of course. Servants are so often summoned to the king's private chamber at midnight for entirely innocent reasons. Eleanor drew a steadying breath. He required assistance. That is the truth. The truth? The woman repeated, tilting her head. My dear girl, truth bends easily in a palace. What matters is perception. And at this moment the perception is not in your favor. Eleanor clenched her hands. Then what does the Queen wish of me? The attendant leaned in slightly. Only that you remember your place, and that you avoid creating unnecessary suspicion. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks. I have not sought suspicion. No, the woman agreed smoothly. But you have certainly attracted it. Their eyes held for a moment. Eleanor forced herself not to look away. At last, the woman stepped back. Take care, Miss Walsh. Not all storms in this palace strike loudly. Some arrive in whispers. She turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving the air colder behind her. Eleanor stood still for a long moment. Her hands shook. She gathered her basket and forced herself to keep working, though each beat of her heart felt like a hammer against her ribs. By late afternoon she had finished her tasks. She made her way toward the servants' dining hall, hoping for a quiet corner where she could gather herself. But before she reached the door, someone called her name sharply. Miss Walsh! She turned and saw one of the stewards approaching. He was a tall man with thinning hair and a habit of looking at everyone as though measuring their usefulness. You are needed in the corridor of the East Wing, he said. She nodded quickly. At once. As she followed him through a long stretch of hall, her steps slowed. The East Wing belonged to the Queen's household. Her mouth went dry. Is Her Majesty requesting me? She asked. The steward did not turn. Her ladyship requested that you report there. That is all I know. Her heart pounded harder with every footfall. When they reached the eastern corridor, he gestured toward a tall door. She is within. Eleanor drew a breath, wiped her palms on her apron, and knocked gently. A voice answered, cold and composed. Enter. She stepped inside. The room was a private sitting chamber, quiet, orderly, and filled with the faint rustle of silk. The Queen sat near a window, hands folded in her lap. Her posture was perfect, her face serene, yet there was something beneath the surface that made Eleanor's skin prickle. Miss Walsh, the Queen said softly, come closer. Eleanor obeyed, stopping a respectful distance away. Your Majesty. The Queen studied her in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke with a delicate calm. I hear you were in the King's chambers last night. Eleanor forced her voice steady. Yes, Your Majesty. I was summoned to assist him with royal garments and documents. The Queen lifted one eyebrow. At such an hour? It was unexpected, Your Majesty, but the King requested my help. Requested, the Queen repeated, tasting the word. How fortunate for you. Eleanor felt her breath hitch. Your Majesty, I assure you. There is no need, the Queen interrupted, raising a hand. I am certain you believe your presence there was harmless. It was harmless, Eleanor insisted. The Queen's smile appeared faintly, but it did not reach her eyes. You are young, and the young often interpret events in ways that flatter themselves. The court, however, is less forgiving, and I find myself concerned. Eleanor's fingers curled tightly at her sides. Concerned in what way, Your Majesty? That a maid might misunderstand her responsibilities, or that she might be misunderstood by others. Neither situation is acceptable. Eleanor swallowed. I do not seek favor, Your Majesty. No, the Queen said softly, but you have gained attention, and attention is a dangerous currency. The words hung in the room like a chill. The Queen continued, her voice smooth as silk. From this moment, you will be reassigned to the lower West Wing, far from the royal apartments, far from misunderstandings. Eleanor felt the ground sway beneath her. Your Majesty, I have done nothing wrong. I did not say you had. The Queen folded her hands. This is merely a precaution, for your own good. The dismissal was quiet, but absolute. You may go. Eleanor bowed deeply, her throat tight. She turned, left the room, and shut the door behind her. The hallway felt colder than before. She walked with stiff steps, trying not to break into a run. But as soon as she reached the far end of the corridor, she leaned back against the wall, breathing hard. Her humiliation felt complete. By the time she reached the west wing, the sun was low and the shadows long. She found herself alone in a rarely used corridor near the smaller staircase. Her thoughts churned, but before they could settle, a soft tap of footsteps approached. A man she recognized at once, one of the Queen's spies, stood watching her. He did not speak. He did not smile. He only held her gaze with cold curiosity, as though assessing how deeply she had fallen. And then he said quietly, "The Queen will be pleased to hear you have taken her warning seriously." Eleanor forced herself to straighten, though her pulse thudded heavily in her ears. The Queen's spy stood only a few paces away, his presence a silent threat. His expression was unreadable, carved from the same cold discipline that governed every corner of the Queen's household. But beneath that stillness, there was something sharper, interest perhaps, or suspicion. She clasped her hands to hide their trembling. "I follow Her Majesty's instructions," she said quietly. Nothing more. The man tilted his head as though weighing her words. "Remember that, Miss Walsh. The palace is no place for misplaced confidence." She bowed her head just enough to satisfy courtesy, then stepped past him. His gaze lingered on her back, prickling her skin long after she had turned the corner. When she reached the west wing, the air felt heavier. This was the quietest part of the palace, far from the music rooms and gathering halls, where forgotten servants performed forgotten tasks. Eleanor's reassignment felt like a sentence without a verdict. No one declared her guilty, but everyone treated her as if she were. She forced herself into routine. Work was familiar. Work required no explanation. She collected linens, polished brass fittings, and scrubbed stair rails. The tasks were simple, but the silence around her made every scrape and sweep sound too loud. Around midday, Sarah slipped into the corridor carrying a bundle of towels. She glanced both ways before approaching Eleanor. "Is it true?" Sarah whispered. "They transferred you here?" Eleanor nodded. The Queen insisted. Sarah's eyes widened, full of sympathy. "For merely assisting the king. This is unfair. Fairness is rare in the palace," Eleanor murmured, "but unfairness is plentiful." Sarah hesitated, then stepped closer and lowered her voice even more. "Eleanor, people are talking, not just servants. Some of the nobles have begun whispering that the king has shown interest in you." Eleanor's breath hitched. "That isn't true." "I know," Sarah said gently, "but truth has never stopped gossip. And some hope the Queen will use it as reason to tighten her influence." Eleanor rubbed her temples. "I only did what I was summoned to do." Sarah squeezed her arm. "You cannot change the whispers. Just be cautious." Eleanor nodded, though caution had already become her every breath. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. She moved through her duties with the precision of someone afraid to misstep. Every time she turned a corner, she feared another calculating pair of eyes would be waiting. Every time she paused to catch her breath, she half expected the Queen's attendants to appear with a new accusation. By late afternoon, her legs ached from climbing stairs and her hands were raw from scrubbing. She rested against a stone wall near the servants' dining hall, grateful for a rare moment of quiet. But the quiet did not last. A young footman hurried toward her, eyes wide. "Miss Walsh, a letter for you." Eleanor blinked. "For me?" He nodded vigorously and offered a small, sealed note. Her stomach twisted when she saw the wax stamp, the king's crest. She stared at the seal, unable to understand why he would write. The footman shifted impatiently. "I wasn't supposed to read it," he muttered, "but I saw the crest. You should be careful. Anyone could see." Eleanor tucked the letter quickly into her apron. "Thank you." He hurried off, leaving her with a pounding heart. She glanced around. The hallway was empty. She ducked into a narrow alcove and opened the seal with trembling fingers. "Eleanor, I regret that you were troubled after last night's work. It was never my intention that your honesty would be questioned. If you would, meet me tonight in the library. We must speak. Edward." Her breath stilled. The king wished to see her again, privately and after dark. Her mind flooded with fear. If anyone discovered their meeting, the whispers would become certainties in the eyes of those eager for scandal. But his words, Honesty, questioned, must speak, echoed through her in a way she could not ignore. She folded the letter quickly, heart racing. That evening, after the palace quieted and most servants withdrew to their quarters, she moved carefully through the West Wing's shadows, avoiding main corridors. She took the servants' stairs two at a time, pausing at each landing to listen. She reached the library wing, where only a few candles glowed in the hallway sconces. She pressed her hand against the doorframe, steadying herself, and entered. The library was dimly lit. Vast shelves towered around her, but she barely saw them. Her eyes found the king almost at once, standing near the long table at the center of the room. He looked tired as he had the night before, but his expression brightened when he saw her. "Eleanor," he said quietly, as though relieved she had come. She bowed her head. "Your Majesty." He stepped toward her, not too close, but near enough that she could hear the softness in his breath. "I feared you would not come." "I nearly didn't," she admitted. "But your letter, your message, seemed urgent." "It was," he said, and motioned for her to sit. She obeyed, though she sat at the very edge of the chair. He remained standing. "I learned of your reassignment," he said, anger flickering beneath his calm. "And I know the Queen summoned you." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of her skirt. "She questioned me, Your Majesty, but she did not accuse me directly." "She did not need to," he replied sharply. "Her household will ensure the whispers grow without her ever speaking a word." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I am afraid, Your Majesty, not for myself, but for how this might reflect upon you." He looked at her with sudden intensity. "Do not concern yourself with my reputation. I am concerned for yours." Her breath trembled. "Mine is already damaged." His jaw clenched. "It should not be. You acted with dignity last night. I should have protected you better." "You owe me no protection," she said quietly. He shook his head. "On the contrary, you were called to serve, and for that you now suffer humiliation. I cannot ignore this." She hesitated. "Your Majesty, why was I truly summoned yesterday?" He studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because I needed someone honest near me. That is the truth." She held his gaze, searching for anything that might warn her away. Instead, she found sincerity, unsteady, but unmistakable. He continued, his voice lower. "Eleanor, do not fear the rumors. They come from those who rely on deceit. You have done nothing improper." "I know," she said softly. "But the Queen's household thinks differently." "The Queen's household," he replied, "thinks only of maintaining influence." Silence stretched between them. She wished she could look away, but the weight of his gaze held her in place. He took a slow breath. "Tell me, Eleanor, are you afraid of me?" "No," she whispered, before she could think. "I fear what others think of you, and what they will think of me." His expression softened. "Then allow me to ease some of that burden." He moved closer, not enough to breach propriety, but enough that she felt the warmth of him, the quiet gravity of his presence. "Whatever happens in this palace," he said gently, "you will not face it alone." Her heart beat so loudly she feared he could hear it. She opened her mouth to answer, but the soft click of a latch froze the words on her tongue. Someone else had entered the library. The king turned sharply. Eleanor remained utterly still. From behind a tall shelf, a shadow moved. A figure stepped into view, one of the Queen's household attendants, a thin man with watchful eyes. He stopped abruptly when he saw them. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," he said, bowing stiffly. "I did not realize you were occupied." Eleanor felt a cold rush run through her. The man's gaze flicked between them, fast but sharp enough to capture the entire scene. The king's expression hardened. "This is a private meeting. Speak your purpose." The attendant bowed again, though his eyes gleamed with quiet accusation. "Her Majesty requests a report on tomorrow's schedule." "Leave it on the table," the king replied curtly. The attendant did so slowly, purposefully. Eleanor kept her face lowered, praying he would not address her. But as he turned to go, he paused. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "shall I inform the Queen that you were engaged in discussion when I arrived?" The king's eyes flashed. "You will inform her only that I was preparing for council. Nothing more." The attendant's mouth twitched in a hint of a smirk, but he bowed and withdrew. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Eleanor exhaled shakily. "He will tell her." The king's voice was tight. "Yes, he will. "What will happen, Your Majesty?" He looked at her with a mixture of regret and determination. "Eleanor, someone has been spreading more than rumors. I received a letter this morning. An anonymous accusation." Her pulse quickened. "Accusation?" The king nodded grimly. "They named you, Eleanor." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. The king's words struck with a force she had not expected, though she had feared something like this from the moment whispers began swirling through the palace. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Me?" she whispered. "They named me." "Yes," the king replied, his jaw tight. "But the accusation is vague. It speaks of impropriety, of influence, of intentions, nothing with substance. Yet even empty accusations can take root in the wrong minds." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. "Who would do such a thing?" He shook his head. "Someone who wishes to wound me without seeming to, and someone who knows you cannot defend yourself." She stared at the table, her breath shallow. "Your Majesty, I fear what they might say next." "I know," he answered softly. "That is why I asked you here. We must face this carefully. I will not allow you to bear this alone." His words warmed something inside her, but fear still pressed heavy on her chest. "I only want to serve in peace. I never wanted any of this." "I know," he said again, gentler still. "And that is why it angers me." He paced a few steps away, running a hand through his hair. The firelight flickered across his face, carving deeper the lines of exhaustion. "I have spent years in this palace surrounded by people who hide daggers behind silk," he said. "People who smile with false loyalty and whisper behind closed doors. But you," he turned toward her, "you are the first person in a very long time who speaks without calculation." Eleanor swallowed. "I do not know how else to speak, Your Majesty." "That," he said quietly, "is what makes you dangerous to those who thrive on deceit." She hesitated. "Will the Queen believe these accusations?" The king's expression darkened. "She will believe whatever suits her purposes, and her household will help her." Eleanor felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to remain upright. "If she thinks I am a threat, she will not rest until she has removed me." The king stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then we must be very careful. Do not give them anything they can twist further." She nodded, though her heart felt bruised. "What must I do, Your Majesty?" "For now, return to your quarters," he said. "Speak to no one about this meeting. And if any new rumor reaches you, tell me at once." She opened her mouth to respond, but another thought struck her sharply. "Your Majesty, if word spreads that you met me privately here—" "I will handle it," he said firmly. "Leave that to me." Eleanor wanted to trust him. His voice carried the conviction of someone determined to protect, yet she knew the Queen's household was capable of weaving lies faster than truth could defend itself. After a long pause, the king spoke again. "Eleanor, look at me." She lifted her gaze. "I will not allow them to destroy your name." Her throat tightened. "Why would you do so much for me?" He hesitated only a second. "Because you have shown me honesty when I am surrounded by shadows. Because you have treated me not as a king but as a man." Her breath caught. She turned away, unsure what to do with the warm ache that blossomed in her chest. He reached for one of the books on the table, not to read but simply to move, perhaps to regain control of the moment. At last he said, "You should go now. The later you remain, the more questions they will create." She nodded and rose from the chair, her legs unsteady. As she reached the door, he called her name again. "Eleanor." She turned. "You have done nothing wrong," he said. The sincerity in his voice nearly broke her. She curtsied and slipped from the library, stepping quietly into the shadowed hall. The palace was too silent, too attentive tonight. She moved swiftly, keeping her head bowed, heart thudding in her ears. But when she reached the staircase leading back to the West Wing, she heard hushed voices drifting from the landing above. She was in there for a long time, long enough. And the king was there too. Mark my words, something is amiss. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, waiting until the footsteps faded. She descended quickly, avoiding anyone who might question her. Only once she returned to the small servants' corridor did she allow herself to exhale. The next morning the tension had thickened like fog. Eleanor arrived early in the laundry room, hoping to disappear into duty. But even here she felt eyes slide toward her, felt whispers follow her across the stone floor. The older maids moved quietly around her, careful not to speak too loudly. The younger ones stole glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Footmen hushed themselves when she passed. She carried bundles of linens to the lower court, forcing her focus on each step. But on her return, she nearly collided with a woman in dark, plum-coloured silk, one of the Queen's closest attendants. The woman's smile was prim and perfectly cold. "Miss Walsh." Eleanor dipped a curtsy. "Good morning, ma'am." The woman stepped closer. "I hear you enjoy late evenings in the library." Eleanor's breath stilled. "I was only delivering—" "Spare me," the woman interrupted. "The Queen wishes to know how long your newfound duties will require you to slip into restricted halls." Eleanor struggled to keep her voice level. "I follow orders given to me." "Yes," the woman said, "and perhaps you follow them too well." Eleanor lifted her chin just slightly. "I have done nothing improper." "That may be true," the woman replied smoothly, "but impropriety does not need truth to be believed." Eleanor stepped back, clutching her basket. "Please excuse me." The attendant watched her retreat with a gaze that pinned her like a needle to cloth. By midday, Eleanor's hands shook with every task. She tried to keep herself steady, but her thoughts spun wildly. Each whisper, each look, each passing comment fused into a web tightening around her. While polishing silver in a quiet alcove, she felt footsteps approach. She kept her focus on her work, hoping the person would pass. Instead, a familiar voice spoke behind her. Soft, cautious. "Eleanor." She turned sharply. It was Thomas, a young clerk from the King's administrative chambers. They had spoken only a handful of times, but he had always been kind in the brief moments they shared. "Thomas," she said, startled. "Should you be here?" He shook his head. "No, but I came to warn you." Her pulse quickened. "Warn me of what?" He looked around, then stepped closer. "The rumor grew overnight. They say you have been meeting the King in secret. The Queen's household is collecting every whispered word." Eleanor felt a stab of panic. But nothing happened. "I know," he said, "but they don't care. And the Queen—" He hesitated. "The Queen plans to present the matter to her advisers." Eleanor's breath caught. "Present? As what?" "As potential misconduct," he whispered. "She wants to show that the King is vulnerable to influence." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "This will ruin me." "Eleanor," Thomas whispered urgently, "you must speak with the King. He needs to know how far they intend to take this." She stepped back, gripping the silver cloth. "I can't. If I go to him again, you will be accused whether you do or not," he said. "At least if you speak to him, he can defend you." She pressed her hand to her chest, steadying her breath. "I'll write a note. A very short one." Thomas nodded quickly. "Give it to me, I'll deliver it discreetly." She grabbed a slip of parchment from a nearby drawer and wrote only a few trembling lines. "Your Majesty, they grow bolder with their lies. I fear what comes next. Please advise me. E.W." She folded it quickly and handed it to Thomas. He tucked it into his jacket. "I'll bring word as soon as I can," he said. She nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Thomas hurried away down the corridor. Eleanor returned to her work, though her hands trembled too badly to polish anything properly. Hours passed without any answer. By evening, she could barely keep her worry contained. She waited in the west corridor, long after others had gone to supper, hoping Thomas would appear. When he finally rounded the corner, he looked pale. "Eleanor," he said breathlessly, "the King received your note. And," she whispered, "he wants to see you. Tonight." Her heartbeat faltered. "Where?" "In the small breakfast room beside the council hall. He said it is safer there." Eleanor nodded, though fear and relief mixed uneasily in her stomach. "When should I go?" "Soon," Thomas said. "But Eleanor, be careful. Someone followed me after I delivered your note." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. "Who?" He shook his head. "I don't know. But be cautious entering the room. I'll watch the corridor for you." Eleanor thanked him and hurried toward the staircase, her breath tight in her chest. When she reached the quiet hallway near the council chamber, Thomas stood by the corner, pretending to examine a tapestry. He gave her a quick nod, the signal that the hall was clear. She approached the small breakfast room, her steps silent, her heart steadying itself for whatever the King would tell her. She touched the latch gently, and just as she pushed the door open, she heard voices inside. Not one voice, two, both unmistakable. the king and the queen. Eleanor froze with her fingertips still resting on the latch. The voices from inside the breakfast room reached her clearly now, sharp in the hush of the empty corridor. She stepped back quickly, flattening herself against the wall beside the door. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it would give her away. The queen spoke first, her tone low and controlled. "You have been ignoring my summons, Edward. This cannot continue." The king answered with a steadiness Eleanor recognized. "I have been attending to state matters. Your summons did not concern them." "Do not pretend this is about state matters," the queen replied. "Your distance has a cause. And if it does," he said, "it is not one you may dictate." Eleanor closed her eyes. She should leave. She knew she should, but her feet would not move. Something in the queen's tone held her fast. "So," the queen continued, "you deny nothing of the rumors, then?" "There is nothing to deny," the king said. "You know well there is no impropriety." "Perhaps not yet," the queen said softly. "But the court sees the girl, and the court whispers. Do you truly think they will remain silent?" Eleanor's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. Inside the room, the king's voice grew firmer. "I will not discuss a loyal servant as if she were a stain on the palace," he said. "Servant?" the queen repeated. "Is that what she is to you? A servant who just happens to appear at midnight in your chambers? A servant who receives private letters? A servant whose name now dances on every tongue from here to the stables?" Eleanor's stomach tightened. She heard the scrape of a chair. Someone standing. "You are not subtle, Edward," the queen said, her voice suddenly colder. "And you are not wise if you think this little fascination will not cost you dearly." "It is not a fascination," he answered. Eleanor's breath stopped entirely. Silence, long and heavy. Then the queen spoke again, her words quieter but sharper. "Do you expect me to tolerate public humiliation again? Do you expect me to endure the eyes of the court while they mock me behind their fans?" "I expect you," he replied, "to understand that cruelty toward an innocent woman is beneath a queen. And I expect," she said, her voice rising slightly, "that you control yourself." Eleanor's hands shook. She felt as though she stood inside a nightmare, one where her name had become a weapon neither she nor the king could pull back from. The queen continued in a cutting whisper. "Remove the girl from the palace, quietly, without explanation. It will end the talk." "No," the king said at once. "Do not be foolish. She is a maid, nothing more." "She is not nothing," the king replied. The queen scoffed. "You defend her too readily. And you attack her without cause." Eleanor pressed her back harder against the wall. Her breath trembled. She could hardly bear to hear another word. The queen's tone shifted suddenly, calmer but more dangerous. "Edward, think carefully. Your past mistakes already haunt you. The council grows impatient with your unpredictability. If they sense weakness, if they sense distraction, they will turn." "I am well aware of the council's tendencies," he answered. "Then act like it," she said. "Dismiss the maid." "No." The refusal hung in the air, hard and immovable. The queen let out a long, slow breath. "Then I will assume you intend to protect her." "I intend," he said, "to protect justice." "Very noble," she replied, "but very foolish." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. She had never wanted the king to defend her at such cost. She had never wanted the queen's hatred, nor the court's eyes upon her. She stepped back from the door ready to flee, but before she could move, the queen spoke again, and her voice pierced the corridor like a blade. "Very well," she said coldly. "If you will not remove her, then I will ensure she removes herself." The king's voice sharpened. "What does that mean?" "It means," the queen answered, "that I know how to make life very uncomfortable for servants who forget their place. You will do nothing of the sort. Do not challenge me on this," she warned. "Do not threaten her," he snapped. Eleanor flinched. Silence followed, thick, dangerous. Then the queen spoke once more, her tone silky with menace. "Take care, Edward. If you insist on keeping her under your protection, the cost may be heavier than you imagine, for both of you." Eleanor stepped back again, ready to escape the sound of those words. But then the queen's voice rose slightly, as if she had turned closer to the door. "Perhaps," she said, "I should summon the girl now. See for myself what spell she has managed to cast over you." Eleanor froze. Her breath stopped. She did not move. She did not blink. The king answered quickly. "You will not summon her. You cannot prevent it. I can, and I will." "You protect her too strongly," the queen whispered. "It only confirms what everyone suspects." At that moment, footsteps sounded inside the room, approaching the door. Eleanor panicked. If she remained where she stood, she would be caught listening. If she fled, they might see her running. She looked wildly around and spotted a narrow servant's door a few feet away. She darted toward it, careful not to make noise, slipped inside, and closed it silently behind her. She pressed herself against the darkness of the hidden passage, heart hammering painfully. The breakfast room door opened. She heard voices spill into the corridor. The queen's voice emerged first. "Perhaps I should speak to the girl myself. She cannot hide behind you forever." The king's voice followed, edged with unmistakable warning. "Eleanor Walsh has done nothing wrong," the queen replied, her tone icy as frost. "Then she will not object to an inquiry." Eleanor clutched the wall, fingers digging into the cold stone. She could almost feel the queen's gaze sweeping the corridor she had just fled. Footsteps paused, a moment of silence. Then the queen's voice again, quieter but full of calculation. "She is close, I can sense it," the king responded sharply. "She is nowhere near here." The queen lingered, as though unconvinced. At last her footsteps retreated, heels tapping steadily against the polished floor. The king's slower steps followed. When the sound finally faded, Eleanor released the breath she had been holding. Her entire body felt weightless with fear. She waited several minutes before stepping back into the corridor. She had no intention of returning to her quarters yet, not until her mind settled enough to walk without trembling. She hurried down the servants' stairwell and into the deeper halls of the palace where few ever wandered. She found a narrow alcove near the old storage rooms and leaned against the wall, barely able to breathe. Hours seemed to pass before she gathered enough strength to return to the West Wing. By then, the palace was settling into evening quiet. She slipped into the small room she shared with two other maids, though they were still on shift. She sank onto her cot, hands trembling, thoughts racing. She felt trapped, between duty and fear, between loyalty and danger, between a king who wanted to protect her and a queen determined to crush her. But another fear crept slowly through her. A fear she had tried to ignore for days. Her breath quickened. She pressed a hand to her stomach. She had hoped it was exhaustion, stress, poor sleep. But the symptoms had grown clearer. Missed days, dizziness, a lingering heaviness she could not deny. She whispered into the quiet room, barely able to speak the truth aloud. "No, no, please, it cannot be." But the fear had already formed. She might be with child, the king's child. Her hands covered her face. She could hardly breathe. A single tear slipped down her cheek. And then, as if summoned by her fear, there came a soft knock at the door. 3 quiet taps. She froze. She rose slowly, wiped her face, and opened the door only a crack. A guard stood outside, holding a folded message. "For Eleanor Walsh," he said, her heart stilled. "From whom?" He hesitated, then leaned closer. "From the king." She took the message with shaking fingers. The guard left at once. She unfolded it quickly. "Eleanor, we cannot wait for matters to worsen. Meet me in the North Tower Terrace at midnight. It is the only place they will not follow. We must talk, Edward." She closed her eyes, barely holding back a sob. And then a voice echoed down the hallway. Soft, cold, unmistakably belonging to the Queen's trusted attendant. "Miss Walsh, are you inside?" Eleanor hid the king's note behind her back so quickly it rustled against her apron. Her pulse thundered. She glanced around the tiny room, hunting for a place, any place, to hide the message. There was no time. The Queen's attendant waited outside, and hesitation alone would make her look guilty. "Miss Walsh?" the voice repeated, firmer now. "I heard movement." Eleanor tucked the folded message beneath the thin mattress in one swift motion, smoothed her apron, and opened the door just wide enough to show her face. "Yes, ma'am?" The attendant's sharp eyes swept immediately past her into the room, searching. "You did not answer the first time I called." "I did not hear it," Eleanor lied, her voice steady only through effort. The woman stepped forward, and Eleanor had no choice but to allow her inside. The attendant's gaze traveled across every corner, The wash basin, the wooden chest, the cots, the modest shelf of cloths. Eleanor's breath clung tight in her throat as the woman approached her bed, the bed under which the king's note now rested. The attendant lifted a folded blanket, examined the pillow, then straightened. Her expression softened only a fraction. "You seem uneasy, Miss Walsh." Eleanor forced a confused look. "It has been a long day, ma'am. Nothing more." The woman clasped her hands. "Then perhaps rest would serve you well, especially considering how closely the Queen will be watching you." Eleanor swallowed. "Ma'am?" The woman stepped closer. "Her Majesty believes you have grown bold, careless, reckless even." Eleanor felt heat climb her neck. "I have not." "Oh, I believe you," the woman said lightly. "But belief is not required. The Queen finds it advantageous to question you, Miss Walsh. You are a useful distraction." Eleanor's breath faltered. "Distraction?" The woman leaned in until her voice curled like smoke. "If the court is busy speculating about a maid, it has less time to look at matters the Queen wishes to keep quiet." Eleanor stiffened. "Then why not remove me? Why keep me near enough to be questioned?" "Because it benefits her," the woman said calmly. "You play your part without even trying." Eleanor stepped back, stomach twisting. "I do not wish to play any part." "Then behave yourself," the attendant snapped suddenly. "Avoid certain corridors, avoid certain rooms, avoid certain eyes." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. She understood. The Queen's warning had grown sharper, more direct, and yet the attendant's expression softened again, as though regretting the brief flash of cruelty. "Just be cautious," she murmured. "For your own sake." Then she swept out of the room, her skirts brushing sharply against the doorway. Eleanor shut the door behind her and sagged against it. Every nerve felt frayed. The King's note lay hidden beneath the mattress, dangerous, precious, terrifying. Midnight, North Tower. They must talk. She pressed a hand to her abdomen. The fear that had been growing inside her these past weeks, quiet, constant, rose sharply. If she truly carried the King's child, everything the Queen suspected would no longer be rumor, but ruin. She sank onto the bed, fingers digging into the thin blanket. Hours still remained before midnight, hours she feared she could not endure. When her roommates returned at dusk, she feigned sleep, but her mind raced through every possible disaster. The Queen's threat, the King's worry, the note, the secret she held within her body. At last the palace fell quiet. Midnight approached. Eleanor slipped from her cot, silent as a shadow. She eased the door open and stepped into the dim corridor where a single candle flickered weakly against the wall. Her shoes made no sound on the stone floor. She took the servants' staircase, avoiding the main halls entirely. The higher she climbed, the colder the air grew. The castle slumbered. Even the guards walked with heavy steps, fighting their own exhaustion. She kept to the darkest corners, breath shallow, praying no one would see her. At the entrance to the North Tower, she paused. A draught swept down the stairwell, carrying a faint whistle. She glanced over her shoulder. No movement, no voices. She climbed. The spiral staircase narrowed as she ascended. A lantern burned near the top, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. She reached the terrace door, pushed it open, and stepped out. Cold air wrapped around her at once. The night sky stretched wide above, stars scattered like pale embers, and standing near the low stone wall, with his cloak wrapped against the wind, was the King. He turned at the sound of her footsteps. "Eleanor." Her breath wavered. "Your Majesty." He approached slowly, studying her face with a mixture of concern and relief. "I was afraid the Queen's household would keep you from coming." "They tried," she said softly. "But I had to. You asked." His expression shifted. Sorrow, guilt, and something deeper flickering in his gaze. "I wish I had never dragged you into this storm." She shook her head. "I chose to come, and I choose to stand here now." He looked away toward the dark gardens below. "This has gone further than I expected. Accusations grow bolder, and the Queen—" "I heard her," Eleanor whispered before she could stop herself. The King turned sharply. "You heard her? I went to the breakfast room. I did not know she was inside. I only heard your voices. I hid before she saw me." He drew a slow breath, anger and worry blending together. "That was not a conversation meant for your ears." "I know," Eleanor said, lowering her head, But I could not walk away without knowing what danger I face, and what danger I have caused you, he said quietly. She lifted her gaze. Your Majesty, the Queen intends to force me from the palace. I will not allow that. You may not have a choice. He stepped closer, his voice steady. There is always a choice. She looked into his eyes, and the fear she had held for days finally broke through her voice. Your Majesty, I carry a greater worry than rumors or reassignment. He stilled. What is it? She hesitated only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. I have not felt well for weeks. I have missed more days than I should have. The dizziness, the exhaustion. She touched her abdomen lightly, her hand trembling. I fear I may be with child. His breath caught. He reached out as though to steady himself on the stone railing, eyes locked onto hers. Eleanor, are you certain? No, she whispered. But the signs, they are familiar. I've seen them in other women in the servants' wing. I cannot ignore them any longer. The king closed his eyes briefly, pulling in a steadying breath. When he opened them again, something fiercely protective burned there. If this is true, he said quietly, you must leave the palace before the Queen discovers it. Eleanor's heart clenched. Leave? Without explanation? Everyone will believe the worst. They already believe the worst, he said. But if you stay, the Queen will destroy you. She will not hesitate. And if she learns of the child... I know. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of a guard's footsteps echoing faintly below. The king moved closer and took her hand gently, not as a ruler to a servant, but as someone who feared losing something precious. You deserve safety, he said softly. You deserve more than these walls. Her voice trembled. Where would I go? I will arrange a cottage near the river. Hidden, discreet. You will have protection, and no one will know you are there. And you? She whispered. He hesitated. I will visit when it is safe. Her heart tightened at the unspoken promise. But before she could respond, the scrape of footsteps sounded from the stairwell. Not slow, weary steps like a guard on patrol. These were quick, purposeful. The king's hand tightened on hers. Eleanor turned toward the staircase just as a tall shadow appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the lantern's glow. A familiar voice sliced through the cold air. Your Majesty, are you alone? Eleanor's heart lurched. The voice belonged to Lord Halston, one of the Queen's most loyal advisers, a man who rarely appeared without purpose and never at midnight without orders. His silhouette filled the doorway, tall and lean, his posture too stiff to belong to someone merely patrolling. The king stepped instinctively in front of Eleanor, his movement subtle but unmistakable. Lord Halston, he said, his voice calm but firm. Why are you here? Halston bowed, though his eyes flicked quickly toward the terrace railing and back again. Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty. I was told you might be in this tower. The Queen requires you at once. At this hour? The king asked. For what purpose? Halston's tone remained smooth, but there was a wary sharpness beneath it. Her Majesty did not specify, only that it was urgent. Eleanor stood utterly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. Her heart hammered painfully. One wrong glance, one twitch of Halston's eyes in her direction, and everything would shatter. She tried to breathe quietly. The cold air felt like shards in her throat. The king did not move. His voice cooled. I am in the middle of something. Halston hesitated, his gaze sweeping the terrace once more. Your Majesty, forgive me, but I see no one else here. Eleanor pressed herself against the stone wall, keeping to the darkest sliver of shadow. If Halston stepped forward even a pace, he would see her. The king's voice sharpened. Your assumption is irrelevant. My presence here does not require explanation. Halston bowed again, though his brow furrowed with suspicion. Of course, Your Majesty. But the Queen was most insistent. The king exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound of irritation and calculation. Tell her I will return shortly. Halston hesitated. Shall I wait for you here? No, the king said at once. Return to her now. I will come. The command was unmistakably final. Halston could not refuse it without risking offense. Still, he lingered a second too long enough for his eyes to trace the railing, the shadows, the king's posture, long enough to sense something amiss. Finally, he stepped back into the stairwell and bowed. "As you wish, Your Majesty." His footsteps receded slowly. Too slowly, Eleanor thought, as though he wished to hear what might happen behind him. The moment Halston's echo vanished, the king turned to Eleanor. "You must leave. Now." Her breath trembled. "But he saw something." "He suspects." "He saw nothing," the king said firmly. "But he felt something was wrong. He will return if we linger." The urgency in his voice pushed away her hesitation. She backed toward the staircase, descending to the servants' passages. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "if he tells the Queen, he will," the king said, his voice low but steady. "But we will manage that when it comes. Tonight, you must stay hidden." Eleanor's footsteps echoed too loudly as she descended. Every sound felt dangerous. Every shadow felt like a watching eye. She reached the base of the tower and slipped into the servants' corridor, breathing through trembling lips. She hurried through the narrow passageways, but her thoughts trailed behind her like frightened ghosts. She might be with child. The Queen intended to corner her. The King intended to protect her, but protection came with its own peril. She reached her room and closed the door quietly behind her. Her roommate still slept, unaware of the danger inching closer through the palace halls. She lay awake until dawn. The next morning, the palace felt heavier than usual. In the west wing, a cluster of servants whispered urgently near the stairwell. They fell silent the moment Eleanor approached. She kept her gaze down, but she caught fragments. Her name, the king, the terrace, the Queen's anger. Her stomach tightened. Sarah approached her quietly, eyes wide. "Eleanor, something happened last night. Everyone is talking." Eleanor stiffened. "What happened?" Sarah hesitated, glancing around to be sure no one listened. "Lord Halston returned from the tower looking unsettled. He went straight to the Queen, and she has not left her room since." Cold crept through Eleanor. "She will turn this against me." Sarah touched her arm gently. "Eleanor, she may already have begun." Before Eleanor could respond, the head steward appeared at the far end of the corridor. His voice boomed through the hall. "Miss Walsh, come forward." Eleanor felt every eye shift to her. The steward's stern face gave nothing away. She stepped toward him, palms damp. "Yes, sir?" He motioned her aside to a quiet corner. "The Queen has requested a formal inquiry concerning your conduct." Her mouth fell open. "Inquiry? You are to report to the antechamber outside her private salon in 1 hour," he said. "Do not be late." Eleanor's breath stuck, her hands trembled. "Sir, I am innocent." "It is not my place to judge," he replied. "My place is only to deliver the Queen's orders." Then he walked away, leaving Eleanor standing frozen in the corridor. Sarah rushed to her side. "Eleanor, this is serious. The Queen will question you, and in front of her household." Eleanor shook her head. "She means to break me. She wants the court to see me crumble." "Then don't crumble," Sarah whispered urgently. "Tell the truth, all of it." But the truth was impossible to tell. The truth would destroy more than Eleanor's reputation. And if the Queen discovered the child? Eleanor pressed a shaking hand to her stomach. "No," she whispered. "I cannot let her question me." "You have no choice," Sarah said. "If you refuse—" "I do not mean to refuse," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "I mean, I cannot let her question me as I am now." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor looked at her friend with wide, frightened eyes. "Sarah, something is wrong. I think I might—" She couldn't finish. The words lodged in her throat. Sarah's face softened. Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. "Oh, Eleanor," Eleanor shook her head quickly. "Please do not say it aloud." Sarah squeezed her hands. "You cannot go to the Queen, not like this." "I know," Eleanor whispered, voice breaking. "I know. But what will you do?" Eleanor looked toward the far halls of the palace, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and shadows lingered in every corner. She wasn't sure. Her thoughts scattered. Her fear thickened. Then a young footman hurried toward her, breathless. "Miss Walsh," he said, lowering his voice, "you must come with me." Eleanor stiffened. "Why?" "It's the King," he whispered. "He requests you at once." Her heart jolted painfully. "Where?" "The old council study," the footman said. "He said it is safer." Sarah's eyes widened. "Eleanor, you cannot be seen going there. If someone follows—" Someone already follows her, the footman said urgently. Two of the Queen's attendants were asking about her minutes ago. She must come now. Eleanor hesitated only a breath before nodding. I'll go. Sarah hugged her quickly. Be careful, please. Eleanor followed the footman through the narrow servants' stairways, keeping her head down, her steps quiet. The palace felt alive with tension, every corridor humming with whispers she couldn't hear clearly. They reached the old council study, a disused chamber tucked behind a thick wooden door. The footman opened it slightly. Inside, he whispered. Eleanor slipped in. The room was dim, curtains drawn. The king stood near the window, hands behind his back, face drawn with worry. He turned when she entered. Eleanor, her voice trembled. Your Majesty, there is an inquiry. The Queen... I know, he said, stepping toward her. Halston has been speaking to her. The inquiry is an attempt to corner you, to force you into a confession she can control. I cannot face her, Eleanor whispered. Not like this. The king studied her, concern deepening. What do you mean? Eleanor tried to speak, but emotion choked her. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. The king's expression changed. Eleanor, are you certain? She shook her head. Not certain, but enough to fear it. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. Then the Queen must not question you. You must leave the palace today. Today, Eleanor whispered. So soon. There is no more time, he said. If she discovers the truth. I know, Eleanor said. I know. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. A carriage will wait by the south gate at sundown. It will take you to the river cottage. Only a few trusted men know of this plan. A cottage, Eleanor repeated, barely able to breathe. Away from all of this. Yes, he said. A place where you will be safe. Her voice cracked. And you? I will visit when I can, he whispered. But your safety comes first. Eleanor felt tears gather, but she forced them back. There was no time for breaking. Your Majesty, thank you. He lifted a hand, as though to touch her cheek, but stopped himself. Eleanor, whatever happens next, you must trust me. I do. He took a step back, his voice steadying. Go now. Pack only what you need. And speak to no one. She nodded, heart pounding. She moved toward the door. But before she reached it, there came a hard, abrupt knock. 3 sharp raps. The king stiffened. Hide, he whispered. Eleanor darted behind a tall cabinet just as the door opened violently. Lord Halston stepped inside, eyes sweeping the room. He bowed, but his tone cut like a blade. Your Majesty, he said, the Queen sent me with a message. The king did not move. Speak. Halston's gaze flicked around the study, searching. The Queen requests that you bring Miss Eleanor Walsh to her chambers at once. Eleanor's breath stopped. Halston took one slow step deeper into the room. And she believes, he added quietly, that you are hiding her. The king did not flinch when Halston stepped farther into the room. His stillness carried authority, quiet, unwavering, the kind that came not from rank, but from certainty. Eleanor, hidden behind the tall cabinet, pressed a hand against her mouth to steady her breath. Every instinct urged her to run, yet her feet remained frozen. Your Majesty, Halston said, narrowing his gaze, the Queen believes Miss Walsh has chosen to disobey her summons. In fact, she suspects the girl is being shielded. The king answered in an even tone. The Queen's suspicions are her own. They do not dictate my actions. Halston tilted his head. She fears the girl's absence may imply guilt. The king's expression hardened just enough to be noticed. Or perhaps it implies the Queen's household has gone too far. Halston hesitated, as though weighing whether to push further. Eleanor prayed he would not. After a tense breath, he bowed. I will inform Her Majesty that you will attend shortly. With or without the girl. That will not be necessary, the king said sharply. I will speak with her myself. Halston stiffened, not enough to be disrespectful, but enough to reveal that the king's dismissal stung. He gave a reluctant bow. As you wish, Your Majesty. He exited, closing the door behind him with a controlled thud. Only when the footsteps vanished from the corridor did the king release the breath he had been holding. Eleanor, he said quietly, you may come out. She stepped from behind the cabinet, her legs unsteady. The relief that washed through her left her weak. He knew, Your Majesty. He knew I was here. He suspected, the king corrected. Not new. And suspicion is not truth. Eleanor's voice broke in a whisper. Suspicion is enough to destroy me. He shook his head. Not anymore. She stared at him, unsure what he meant. The king crossed the room to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to glance toward the courtyard below. His posture was thoughtful, steady, but something in his expression had changed. It was no longer merely concern. It was decision. Eleanor, he said softly, the Queen's power over this palace is ending. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Ending? He turned back to her. For years I tried to hold the monarchy together through patience, through silence, through peace. But last night, she crossed a boundary she cannot uncross. Eleanor stepped closer. What boundary? The council received evidence this morning, he said. Documents proving she has manipulated state correspondence, interfered with decisions that were not hers to touch, used her attendants to spy on ministers, even forged my signature on a treaty proposal. Eleanor stared at him, stunned. How long have you known? Not long, he admitted, but long enough to act. What will happen to her? She asked quietly. The council and I will address it formally, he replied. The process has already begun, though no one outside the highest ministers knows. She will not be harmed, but her influence will be removed, permanently. Eleanor clasped her hands. And me? Will she still? No, he said gently. You are no longer under her command. She no longer has authority to demand your presence. The relief came slowly, almost painfully. The fear she had carried for weeks began to loosen, thread by thread. Eleanor lowered her head. Your Majesty, I do not know how to thank you. He stepped toward her. I do not ask for gratitude, only that you believe me when I say this. You have suffered because of the Queen's desperation, not because of anything you ever did. Eleanor felt a tremor pass through her. Part grief, part relief. I wanted only to serve quietly. You tried, he said, and you were punished for it. She blinked back tears. The king's voice softened further. But that time is over. You no longer stand alone in this. Eleanor hesitated, then found the courage to speak. Your Majesty, the child. He nodded once, his expression gentle. If your fear proves true, then the child will be protected. You have my word. She lowered her gaze. It will cause a scandal. He took her hand, not with passion, not with urgency, but with a kind of calm assurance that flooded her with warmth. Eleanor, he said, I no longer care about the court's whispers. My only concern now is truth, and the future we must build from it. She looked up at him. The future? Yes, he said, but you must rest. Your strength has been pushed far beyond what anyone should endure. You will remain in a quiet chamber in the north wing, not the cottage, not yet. The council will meet today and confirm the Queen's removal. Once the matter is settled, your safety within the palace will be restored. Eleanor's breath shook with disbelief. You mean I may stay? For now, he said, until all dangers have passed. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Thank you. He offered a faint smile, the first she had seen from him in days. Thomas will escort you to the chamber. Only he and a trusted guard will know where you are. And the Queen, she whispered. She will be occupied, he said, for a long time. The weight of fear finally loosened from her shoulders. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, but she held her composure. The king squeezed her hand gently before letting it go. Be calm, Eleanor, he said. All shall soon be as it should. She bowed her head. I trust you. He stepped back, and the moment passed. The king adjusted his cloak. I must go to the council now. They are waiting. Eleanor nodded. And I will go where you said. Thomas arrived moments later, his expression tight with worry but relieved to find Eleanor safe. He guided her through the servants' corridors, avoiding the Queen's wing entirely. They climbed a narrow staircase rarely used, emerging at the north wing, a quiet, almost forgotten part of the palace. Thomas opened a small door. Inside was a modest but clean chamber, with a bed near a window overlooking the gardens. Sunlight pooled gently across the floor. It's safe here, Thomas said. No one comes to this wing. The king said you are to rest. Eleanor stepped inside and felt her heart ease for the first time in weeks. Thank you, Thomas. He nodded, his voice soft. If you need anything, food, water, medicine, send word. She smiled faintly. I will. He bowed and closed the door quietly behind her. Eleanor sat on the bed, her fingers loosening around the last threads of fear. She let her shoulders drop, her breath steady, her heartbeat calming. For the first time, she felt she could breathe without flinching. Hours passed quietly. Soft light shifted across the walls as the day moved toward evening. Eleanor listened to the distant hum of the palace, the footsteps, the muted conversations, the turning of a world that had once seemed intent on destroying her. Now, slowly, it began to feel different. By the time dusk settled, a soft knock sounded at her door. It was Thomas again, holding a tray of food. His voice carried warmth. "Eleanor, the council has reached its decision." She straightened. "And?" Thomas exhaled with visible relief. "The Queen has been removed from her position in state matters. She will retain her title, but her influence is ended. She has been ordered to take residence in her private villa outside the palace walls." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Truly?" He nodded. "Truly?" She closed her eyes, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "Then it is over." Thomas hesitated. "Not entirely. But the danger is gone." She looked up. "And the king? He is preparing a statement for the ministers. But he asked me to tell you." Thomas paused, then finished softly, "that you are safe now." Her shoulders sagged in relief. Thomas stepped back into the hall. "I'll return later. Rest while you can." Eleanor thanked him and closed the door. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as daylight faded into twilight. Peace, fragile but real, settled around her. And beneath her palm, she felt a quiet, uncertain flutter that might have been her imagination, or the first whisper of a new life growing inside her. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Her fear had not disappeared, but its hold had loosened. The world no longer felt like a trap closing around her. It felt like a door opening, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. Eleanor whispered into the quiet room, her eyes warm with belief. Everything will be different now. Eleanor woke before dawn, long before the palace stirred. A pale glow crept through the north wing window, laying a soft shimmer across the quiet chamber. For the first time in weeks, her sleep had not been torn apart by fear. Yet her heart beat with an uneasy anticipation, as though the earth beneath her knew her life was about to change. A gentle knock sounded at the door. She rose, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. When she opened the door, Thomas stood waiting. He looked tired but hopeful. "The king requests your presence," he said. "In the old garden behind the chapel. He wishes to speak with you privately." Eleanor's breath trembled. "Privately." Thomas nodded. "He said it is time." Those words, simple, quiet, sent warmth rushing through her chest. She followed him through the silent corridors of the north wing, then down narrow staircases few ever used. The palace was only just waking, servants beginning their duties, sunlight brushing the high windows. But the garden behind the chapel was empty. A thin mist drifted across the stone path, making everything feel dreamlike and untouched. And standing near the small fountain, cloaked in the early light, was King Edward. He turned when she approached, and his expression softened at the sight of her. There was no worry in his gaze now, only resolve, and something deep and warm she had never seen full in his face before. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you have rested?" She nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." "You may call me Edward," he said gently. Her breath caught and she lowered her eyes. "I am not certain I should." "Then allow me to give you reason," he said. He stepped closer. She felt her pulse leap. He studied her for a moment, as though memorizing every detail. Her eyes, her breath, the quiet steadiness she had gained after so many storm-torn days. He spoke softly. "The council knows the truth. They know what the Queen has done. And they know how you suffered because of it. Her influence has ended, and the court now looks to the future with new eyes." Eleanor clasped her hands tightly. "I only wish for peace. For both of us, peace," he repeated quietly. "I want more than peace, Eleanor." Her heart trembled. He took another step, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence against the morning chill. "Do you remember," he asked, "the night you came to my chambers? You were trembling. You whispered, 'Please, do it quickly.' And I thought you feared punishment. But instead I saw courage, bravery in the face of a world that tried to silence you. Eleanor lowered her gaze. I was frightened. Of everything. You still walked toward me, he said. And everything changed that night. Not because of scandal, not because of fear, but because I saw you. She looked up, surprised. Me? Yes, he said. A woman who speaks honestly, who faces cruelty with dignity, who carries more strength than anyone in that palace. Her throat tightened and she blinked back tears. Eleanor, he continued, I meant what I said on the terrace. I meant every word. But now I may speak them freely. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, as if the garden itself held its breath. He reached out his hand, not commanding her, not claiming her, simply offering. You deserve more than secrecy, more than fear, more than the shadows they forced around you. His voice fell to a tender whisper. You deserve a life built with truth and with love. Her breath stopped. Tears gathered in her eyes. Edward, she whispered. He stepped even closer, his voice steady, despite the emotion trembling beneath it. Eleanor Walsh, he said, I love you. I have tried to resist it for your sake more than mine. But love does not bend to politics. It does not obey fear. It simply exists. And mine for you has grown with every moment we have endured. A soft gasp escaped her. She pressed a hand to her chest. Your Majesty. I do not know what to say. He took her hand, gently, reverently. Say only what is true. She looked into his eyes that had once been weary, guarded, unreachable. Now they shone with a quiet devotion that made her heart ache with joy. And she found her voice. I love you, she whispered. I tried to hide it. I tried to deny it. But it grew despite every fear. And it frightened me because I did not believe such a love could ever be meant for someone like me. He lifted her hand, holding it between both of his. It was always meant for you, he murmured. Tears fell softly down her cheeks, but she smiled through them. Her heart felt weightless, full, finally free. He lowered to one knee, not with royal ceremony, not with courtly flourish, but with a sincerity that made her entire world still. Eleanor, he said, I cannot promise a simple life. We will face whispers and doubts and the remnants of what the Queen built. But I can promise this. You will never stand alone again. Not as a servant, not as a secret, but as my equal, my partner, my wife. Her breath broke into a quiet sob. He extended his hand. Will you marry me? She pressed her hands to her lips, struggling to breathe through the rush of joy that overwhelmed her. The sound of the fountain, the soft breeze, the entire garden felt wrapped around them, holding them in a perfect stillness. Yes, she whispered, then louder, steadier. Yes, Edward. I will. He rose and drew her into his arms, not tightly, not desperately, but with a gentle certainty, as though holding something precious and long awaited. Their foreheads touched, breaths mingling, hearts beating in unison. A warmth spread through her chest. Relief, love, freedom. Every moment of humiliation, every whispered accusation, every night of fear melted away in his embrace. You have given me my life back, she whispered. And you, he murmured, have given me purpose. He stepped back slightly, brushing a tear from her cheek with the back of his finger. The wedding will be private at first. Only the ministers must know until the court adjusts. But soon the kingdom will see you as I do, not a servant girl, not a scandal, but a woman of strength, grace, and courage. Eleanor shook her head softly. I want no crown, Edward. Only you, and you shall have me, he said, smiling warmly, always. He took her hand again and guided her toward the chapel door. A minister waited inside. The king must have prepared this long before dawn. Eleanor's breath trembled, but she felt steady beside him. Inside the chapel the candles flickered gently, their glow soft and welcoming. No crowd, no court, no prying eyes. Only two witnesses, the minister and the morning sun spilling through the stained glass. The vows were simple, spoken not with formality but with feeling. When Edward slid the gold band onto her finger, her hands shook, but her heart felt unshakably sure. And I, he said softly, take Eleanor to be my wife. And I, she whispered, take Edward to be my husband. At the minister's blessing, Edward kissed her hand with a tenderness that brought tears streaming down her face. Then, with a breathless smile, he drew her close and kissed her lips, soft, steady, full of the love they had survived to reach. It was not a kiss of passion alone, but of promise, of endings and beginnings, of every storm weathered, every whisper silenced, every fear laid to rest. When they stepped out of the chapel as husband and wife, the sun broke fully over the horizon, casting light across the garden. Edward held her hand as though it had always belonged there. "You are free now," he whispered. "We both are." Eleanor looked at him, her husband, her king, her love, and felt the truth settle deep within her. "I am," she said, smiling. At last, he drew her close once more, sealing the morning with quiet joy. The palace beyond them was changing. The whispers would fall away. The kingdom would heal. And she, once a frightened maid, had risen into a life shaped not by fear but by love. Together they walked forward through the golden morning, hand in hand, ready for the world that would greet them as one. Behind them the chapel door stood open, sunlight pouring through like a blessing. Ahead of them the future waited, and as they stepped into it, a gentle voice from the corridor called out breathlessly, "Your Majesties, there is news you must hear at once. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.